On the night of the 6th of December 2014, a vehicle burned beside a quiet rural road in Courtland, Mississippi. When firefighters arrived, they expected to find a car fire. Instead, they found a 19-year-old woman walking toward them. Her name was Jessica Lane Chambers. She had been doused with gasoline and set on fire. Her body was covered in devastating burns, and despite the severity of her injuries, she was still alive. For a brief moment, Jessica was able to speak, and what she said would become one of the most important and most disputed pieces of evidence in a murder case that has never been solved. Jessica Chambers was a young woman from Courtland, a small community in Panola County, Mississippi, roughly 70 miles south of Memphis. Friends and family remembered her as outgoing, funny, and full of energy. She had a smile that people close to her remembered immediately. Like many teenagers, she was building a life, making plans, and spending time with friends. On December 6, Jessica spent part of the day with people she knew before returning to her mother's home. Later that afternoon, she took a nap. Then, sometime in the early evening, Jessica left the house. She was driving her Kia sedan. At some point, she stopped at a gas station and purchased gasoline. Investigators would later establish that she had been seen in the area before disappearing from view. Not long afterward, Jessica was driving along a rural road near Courtland. What happened next remains the central mystery of the case. At around 8 o'clock that night, emergency services received a report of a vehicle fire. When firefighters arrived, Jessica was no longer inside the car. She was found nearby, badly burned and still alive. The scene was horrifying. Her vehicle was on fire, and Jessica had suffered burns over more than 90% of her body. She was transported first for emergency treatment and then taken to a burn center in Memphis. Doctors determined that her injuries were catastrophic. The burns were extensive, and she had also suffered severe damage from smoke inhalation. Jessica would die from her injuries the following day. She was 19 years old. The case was immediately treated as a homicide. Investigators believed someone had attacked Jessica, poured gasoline on her, and set her on fire. But before Jessica was taken away from the scene, several first responders said she attempted to identify the person responsible. According to their testimony, when asked who had done this to her, Jessica appeared to say a name that sounded like Eric. Some witnesses heard Eric. Others believed she may have said Derek. The problem was that Jessica was in an extreme medical condition. Her injuries made communication incredibly difficult. Still, multiple first responders gave similar accounts of hearing the same name. That single word would later become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, because investigators had another name in mind: Quinton Tellis. Tellis and Jessica had known each other for a relatively short period of time. Their relationship was described as casual and complicated. They had communicated frequently in the weeks before Jessica's death. Investigators later examined their phone records and text messages. According to prosecutors, the two had been together on the day Jessica was killed. Tellis initially gave investigators an account of his movements that prosecutors argued was false or inconsistent. As investigators continued examining phone data and other evidence, they built a timeline placing Jessica and Tellis in the same general area before the fire. The prosecution would later argue that Tellis had the opportunity to kill Jessica, and that evidence connected him to the scene. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, and that the investigation had focused too heavily on Tellis while failing to prove that he was the person who killed Jessica. The case would ultimately become a battle between two very different interpretations of the same evidence. One of the most significant pieces of physical evidence involved Jessica's car keys. Investigators found the keys away from the burning vehicle, in an area connected to the route prosecutors believed Tellis may have taken. DNA testing also became part of the case, but the results were not simple. The prosecution argued that Tellis could not be excluded from DNA found on the keys. The defense argued that this did not prove when or how the DNA got there, and did not prove that Tellis had killed Jessica. There was no clear eyewitness who saw Tellis attack Jessica. There was no murder weapon, and the investigation never produced a definitive confession. Instead, the state's case relied heavily on a combination of phone records, movements, changing statements, physical evidence, and the theory that Tellis was the person Jessica had been trying to identify. But there was a major problem. The name heard by multiple first responders did not clearly sound like Quinton. Prosecutors would later argue that Jessica may have been trying to say something else, or that her condition made the word difficult to understand. The defense argued that the dying statement pointed away from Tellis, and the question became impossible to ignore. If Jessica was trying to identify her attacker, who was she saying? Eric? Derek? Or something else entirely? That uncertainty followed the case into the courtroom. In February 2016, Quinton Tellis was indicted for capital murder. He maintained his innocence. The first trial took place in 2017. The prosecution presented evidence designed to place Tellis with Jessica and establish a timeline leading to the fire. The defense challenged the reliability of the evidence and argued that the state had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. After deliberating, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. The trial ended in a mistrial. There was no conviction. There was no acquittal, and for Jessica's family there was still no answer. A second trial began in 2018. Once again, the prosecution presented its case against Tellis. Once again, the defense challenged the evidence. And once again, the jury became deadlocked. After deliberations, jurors told the judge they could not reach a unanimous decision. For the second time, a mistrial was declared. 2 trials, 2 juries, no verdict. Quinton Tellis had never been convicted of Jessica Chambers' murder. The result left the case in an unusual legal and emotional position. Investigators had identified a suspect. Prosecutors had brought that suspect to trial twice. But neither jury was able to unanimously determine that he was guilty. And the central mystery remained. Who attacked Jessica Chambers? Why was she set on fire? And why did the name heard at the crime scene fail to provide a clear answer? For Jessica's family, the legal outcome could not erase what happened. A 19-year-old woman had been found burning beside a rural road. She had survived long enough for first responders to hear her voice. She had survived long enough for investigators to believe she might have identified her attacker. But the words were never clear enough to settle the case. And the evidence against the man accused of killing her was never strong enough to produce a conviction. The murder of Jessica Chambers remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Mississippi. Her killer has never been convicted. The 2 trials against Quinton Tellis both ended in mistrials. And while the case has generated years of debate, theories, and controversy, the courtroom never delivered a final answer. On a quiet road in rural Mississippi, a young woman was attacked and left to die. Her final moments became the center of an investigation that crossed state lines, survived 2 trials, and divided the interpretation of nearly every major piece of evidence. But after all these years, the most important question remains unanswered. Who killed Jessica Chambers? And why? Until those questions are answered, the case remains open in the minds of the people who loved her and unresolved in the history of true crime. Jessica Chambers was 19 years old, and on the 6th of December 2014, her life ended in a fire that investigators believe was deliberately set. More than a decade later, no one has been convicted of her murder. If you enjoy true crime documentaries, unsolved mysteries, and chilling criminal investigations, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. New cases are waiting to be uncovered.